Hello, and welcome to the Digital Forensic Expert Testimony performed by the United Kingdom Team5. Today's testimony will be provided by Herbert White, the subject matter expert and lead digital forensic examiner. Before we dive into the questions, we will briefly discuss the 5I Alliance and what nations are involved, an overview of 3 previous projects leading up to this point in time. We'll also have the expert testimony from the lead examiner, and then questions, comments after the conclusion of the testimony. The 5I nations consist of the United Kingdom, United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. These countries agree to collect, analyze, and share signal intelligence, as well as work together to shape best practice cybersecurity principles. They also work together to share data according to respect to their own nations, meaning that the data that is shared is only what is necessary to improve global cybersecurity practices. Too much information could reveal too much about a nation's security and practices that protect their own nation. Project 1, which was the Global Economic Summit, consisted of the 5I Alliance nations setting up a network infrastructure. Because the summit is so important and so noticeable to the public, they were a prime target for a cybersecurity attack because of the information that's being shared. A security baseline was conducted to set up what devices, tools, techniques, and procedures would be used during the summit. A transnational legal compliance report was also done so that all nations will act within the guidelines of all the nations involved, so that there's no conflict whatsoever. The last thing that was done was an incident response plan and reporting, so that the nations know what to do in the event of an incident and how the reporting will be done. You need to know how the incident was discovered, the root source of it, and what was done to mitigate. Now that the 5I nations have set up the network infrastructure, vulnerability and risk assessments were done to see if the threat attackers did indeed attack the network, and if they did, what would be the impact. Where did the attack occur on the network, and what can be done to mitigate? Network environments have vulnerabilities that need to be evaluated carefully to associate risk, and how effectively to secure the network comes next. So in this project, we focus on the vulnerabilities and risk of the network infrastructure, vulnerability assessments and risk matrix, service level agreements in the event that an attack did occur, and how quickly can things be resolved, and then a 5I's indication sharing report from all the nations, just sharing the information of the vulnerabilities and risk involved in the network infrastructure, and how to build a better security posture. Project 3 consisted of a ransomware attack and what should be done to better prepare for a cybersecurity attack like a ransomware attack, and what should be done to mitigate a ransomware attack should it happen. In this case, we came up with a business continuity plan, situational reports regarding attacks on the network and how they were either resolved, currently being investigated, or unresolved. We also had cyber operations and risk management briefing, and most importantly, we had a forensics investigation report to dive deeper into how the ransomware attack started and where it began, and what evidence is collected to show proof of these findings. Listed here are the types of attacks that were done during the Global Economic Summit. The distributed denial of service attack was done to interrupt service amongst the 5I nations. Data exfiltration occurred when anomalous activity was observed over the network. And the ransomware attack was done preventing the nations from entering their systems at a certain point in time. Labs were used to take a closer look of these attacks. Wireshark was used to examine packets and packet sniffing. Snort rules were used to defend against further attacks. And FTK was used to conduct a forensic analysis to gather evidence and determine the who and what and prove how the attack was done. What are the legal challenges associated with cyber incidents involving foreign countries? How do internal laws affect e-discovery? Some of the challenges that need to be recognized here are that laws, regulations, policies, and procedures are different based on each country. An interpretation of cyber crimes is different across the board for the nations as well. Where the attack is coming from, the who or what did the attack, and what is the penalty based on the attack and the impact. These are all considerations that need to be taken under consideration. Internal effect of e-discovery is based on the biggest factor of information, and that's privacy. The location of the attackers or the location of the attack determines how to go about collecting what is needed to form findings in a case. Privacy protects data, and nations must understand how to request information and gather evidence, especially when it's between two different nations. What are the legal challenges of accessing and retrieving electronic evidence stored on foreign soil? Assuming cloud storage was used, what procedures were followed to access and retrieve digital evidence stored in the cloud? The most important question here is, where is the data stored? The challenge becomes going directly to the service provider of where the evidence is, or working with the host nation to obtain the evidence with respect to that nation. What you want to do here is get a search warrant and start a chain of custody so that the evidence can be properly logged. You're allowed to obtain that evidence, more importantly, but the one thing you want to make sure of is that the evidence is properly logged so that, it is not inadmissible in court. In terms of cloud storage, a country's internet service provider should take priority over the host nation itself, but the proper laws and regulations of the host nation should be used to determine where the evidence is stored. Privacy, throughout all this, privacy is still a big factor, and the corresponding laws and regulations of their host nation must always be enforced. Specific to the United Kingdom, how do the international laws and jurisdictions influence the processes and procedures followed during the forensic investigation? The UK is heavily involved in the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, and they also created the Data Protection Act of 2018, which focuses on the data protection and privacy. While the nations have similar but different laws, the nations all agreed on protection or protective measures before the summit began. This includes how to encrypt data at rest and in transit or in motion, firewalls that are used, and proxies, authentication factors, which are all important to ensure data protection. What conflicts arose between ethics and international laws during the forensic investigations? How did these conflicts affect the investigations, and how were the conflicts mitigated and resolved? The forensic investigation being conducted presented some conflicts for sure. The biggest conflict is that the threat could be from one of the Five Eyes nations. This could mean that there's a strong possibility of an insider threat. We have to be very careful and cautious with the allegations. This could cause conflict with the Five Eyes nations, so you have to remember that the cyber actions are interpreted differently across all of the nations. This could bring conflict in how evidence is gathered. Thankfully, this was mitigated and resolved by collaborating and establishing cybersecurity policies and best practices before the summit began. What steps were taken to protect the United States soil and citizens during the international investigation? Describe any risk to the country, businesses, or citizens from your investigations. Initially, each nation involved in the summit agreed to conduct analysis and research on each other's laws, regulations, policies, and procedures as it pertains to security. Such things as the GDPR, Data Protection Act, and NIST guidelines were all common grounds in formulating that set of rules and boundaries so that that was to ensure that a crime wasn't committed unintentionally. If a crime was committed by a nation's business or citizen on another nation, then they are subject to consequences and legal actions of that nation that they attack. This concludes the expert testimony from the forensic examiner, Herbert White. If there are no comments or questions, thank you on behalf of the United Kingdom Team 5.